that he had at least some knowledge of how to use that firearm. Jeff Gardier, I want to go to you. We are seeing a little bit of motion there at the podium, so if I cut you off, just
sure.
Please let me cut you off. But the one thing that I want to ask, and that is, you know, you and I have been going through this manifesto, 140 pages. He writes this story. This is the story of his life. He wanted people to know. When you look at somebody like Adam Lanza, in the Sandy Hook shooting, he destroyed all evidence. He destroyed the computer disks, the hard drive, smashed it to bits. It went to Quantico. Even they couldn't piece it back together. What is the difference between somebody who does something like this, that's so well written, so prepared, and somebody who wants to erase all traces that he was ever here?
Well, Adam Lanza never had a connection to society, to people. He had sensory deprivation disorders. He had some sort of schizophrenia that was going on, and he just could not be around people. He was awkward. You could see it in all of his physical movements. Elliot Rodger, on the other hand, much more higher functioning, much more narcissistic, and wants to tell his story.
Okay, now, some people are gathering at the press conference, so until they actually begin to speak, let's just keep talking. The personality disorder here that we've been talking about, and you know, Brian Claypool, you earlier said that, you know, this is something that you don't know whether enough was done or enough could be done. Have you dealt with a criminal defendant like this person before? And again, I'm going to cut you off if they start talking, so just beware.
Sure. Deborah, I've actually dealt with plenty of civil rights cases in which victims have been shot by law enforcement and they have been mentally challenged and they've had mental disabilities. So I'm very sensitive to the mental health aspect of this. Is that in a situation like this and the other mass shootings we've had, you've got to look at the red flags. There are red flags. What we as a society do with these red flags is really the teachable moment in all of this. And for example, you know, Lou was talking a little bit about gun control. I think maybe a suggestion I have is, and tell me, somebody out there, if we don't already have it, is if somebody is treated by a psychologist and there is a medication prescribed to that patient that deals with depression, anger, rage, or a mental disorder, and they already own a gun, then somehow we have to have a system in place where the gun can be revoked, that there's a procedure in place to do that. So I think there's things we have to do here to try to take back the guns if there is a mental disability, if that makes sense.
Which is fascinating, but then you've got to also take into consideration the fact that people are going to have access to those medical records. You know, the HIPAA laws are so tight right now that, in fact, anybody who has a mental disorder, whether it comes or it doesn't,
The second incident occurred on January the 15th of 2014. When suspect Roger contacted our agency and accused one of his roommates of stealing 3 candles that were valued at $22. Roger made a citizen arrest of the roommate on a charge of 488 of the Penal Code, which is petty theft. The roommate was booked into the jail, subsequently cited and released. And later, the case was subsequently referred to the district attorney, who filed a petty theft charge in that case. The third incident occurred April the 30th of 2014, when sheriff's deputies contacted the suspect at his residence following a request to check on his welfare. That request had originated from a family member. The deputies contacted the suspect at the time, found him to be polite and courteous. He downplayed the concerns for his welfare, and the deputies cleared the call. I want to now go into a chronology of the events that occurred last night. We believe we have a fairly good, albeit perhaps somewhat still rough, chronology of the suspect's actions last night. We have identified 10 separate locations where criminal activity took place. In several of those locations, there are actually more than one, but I'm going to go through these locations, refer to them as 1 through 10. you have received a sheet that has a map of Isla Vista with the numerals on that sheet to give you an idea of where the incident or how the incident unfolded and where what I'm about to tell you occurred. Location number 1, it appears as though suspect Roger murdered 3 victims within his residence in the 6500 block of Seville Road prior to the shooting rampage that took place last night. The 3 male victims appear to have been repeatedly stabbed. We are still processing that crime scene, and we are still in the process of positively identifying the victims and notifying their next of kin, so I will not have their identities for you at this time. The second location was the beginning of last night's rampage, and that was at the Alpha Phi sorority in the 800 block of Embarcadero del Norte. Several members of this sorority reported hearing loud and aggressive knocking at the front door, which lasted for 1 to 2 minutes. Fortunately, no one opened the door, and shortly afterwards, witnesses reported seeing 3 young women who were standing outside in the vicinity, shot by the suspect from across the street. The victims' names, 2 of those victims were fatally wounded, and 1, thankfully, is still alive. The 2 victims who were Breanne Cooper, a 22-year-old, and Veronica Elizabeth Weiss, a 19-year-old. Both of these young ladies were UCSB students. Those were the 2 who were killed, and the 3rd victim, who is still alive, suffered multiple gunshot wounds. The written document that apparently was written by the suspect. We became aware of that fairly quickly in the investigation last night, and in reading this 141-page rambling autobiographical, almost a combination of an autobiography and a diary, it's very apparent of the severe extent of how disturbed Mr. Roger was, and the fact that he had been and was continuing to be seen by a variety of different healthcare professionals, but it's very, very apparent that he was severely mentally disturbed when you review that document. And the videotape is a chilling. There were several videotapes that he had posted, but the one that was posted just prior to the attack is a particularly chilling one, in which he basically looks at the camera and talks about what he is about to do.
Sure. Given that you're describing him as really very mentally disturbed, characterize your deputies and your actions against why they're trying to.
What I can tell you is that when the deputies contacted him, this was in response to a check on the welfare call, to check on his welfare, to see how he was doing out of concern for him. The deputies contacted him directly at his residence, and they determined that he did not meet the criteria for an involuntary mental health hold. He was, as I said, timid and shy. He did not meet the criteria for 5150 of the Welfare Institutions Code, which is what would authorize him being held temporarily for an examination. He expressed to the deputies that he was having difficulties with his social life and that he probably would not be returning to school in the next year.
The case that you're talking about now and knowing what happened here, is there anything in hindsight you think your agency didn't do that should have been done, or is there anything you regret?
Well, I'm not going to go back and play Monday morning quarterback at this point. We're still investigating this incident and exactly what happened in the interaction that they had. But you've got to understand that this is a fairly routine type of call that is quite commonplace. And the deputies, who are well trained and are adept at handling these types of calls, did contact this gentleman in an effort to determine whether or not his welfare was imperiled, and did not believe, for the reasons that they had as a result of that contact, that he required any further care. So I'm not going to second guess them at this point.
What was the specific welfare concern? What can you tell us about the events that happened at the apartment complex in this relation?
As you are aware, in the manifesto, he lays out a plan on what he intended to do. I will, without getting into too much detail, I will say that there are three people that were murdered in the apartment. It appears as though that happened prior to him going on this mobile shooting rampage. The three male victims were apparently stabbed repeatedly with sharp objects, and it was a pretty horrific crime scene.
All right, so we want to recap a lot of the interesting details, things now lining up in this tragic rampage last night. We now know that three men were killed at the apartment of the suspect, Elliot Rogers. 2 women were killed outside of a sorority. 1 young man killed at a deli, and at that deli, Roger actually got out of the car and opened fire. Catherine Brianne Cooper, Veronica Elizabeth Weiss, Christopher Ross Michael Martinez, those are the names of the victims, all of them UC Santa Barbara students that were attending college there. The guns, 3 of them, all purchased more than a year ago, according to the timeline, from federally licensed dealers in 3 separate cities. There was a 9mm, there were 2 Sig Sauer 9mm semi-automatic handguns and 1 Glock. The amount of ammunition, startling. For the Sig Sauers, 34 loaded magazines, each with 10 rounds in them. For the Glock, 7 loaded magazines with 10 rounds inside of them. The sheriff made clear that, in fact, because this young man was not institutionalized, there was nothing that showed up on his chart saying that he was prevented from purchasing their guns.